Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about the different steps you need to take in order to do a more intermediate or intricate design on your cookie. Basically, it's like coloring in the lines with frosting, and you can definitely do it. There's just some tips and tricks that will help it come out better in the end. So let's get started. I'm working on a set of birthday cookies centered around books and plants, starting a new chapter, if you will. So I found this image on the internet and I traced it onto a cookie using my Kodak Luma microprojector. One thing you want to do when you're doing a cookie with many small areas is you want to use a thicker icing so that your icing doesn't crater. As thick as you can do and still smooth it out by jiggling a scribe or a toothpick in your icing. And you also want to put a row of icing in the middle of the little sections and let it dry for a couple seconds or a couple minutes so that it helps prevent the craters and helps keep the icing in the middle from sinking in these small areas. Another thing you want to do to help prevent cratering is to put the cookie in front of a fan or in a dehydrator as soon as possible so that it crusts over the top of the icing before it has a chance to sink. Now for the pages of the books, you see that I'm putting down a row of white icing and then flattening it out with a paintbrush. And then when that dries, I'm going to go over it and give it another row of icing. I don't want it to be perfectly smooth. I want it to kind of look like pages of a book. And I don't want it to be puffy because I want the cover of the book to stand out away from the pages. Another tip for when you're decorating cookies that have a lot of little small areas and is a more intricate design is you want to work from the background to the foreground. So you want to do the things that will be farthest away from you first, working up to the things that are closest, and that way you can build up the design so that the things that are closest to you have more puffiness in the icing and are kind of on top if they're touching the sections that should be farther away. I hope that makes sense. For areas of icing that are touching other areas of icing and you want there to be some separation between the areas instead of having it all melt together, make sure that you flood in one section and then let that crust or dry for about 5 to 10 minutes before flooding in the section that's immediately next to it. Also, if you don't want your outline that we piped earlier to show, make sure you go over that outline with your flood icing when you fill in the section. You can use these tips and techniques on any cookie design that you're doing that has small areas or is a little bit more detailed. If you want to add texture to some of the smaller areas of your cookies, you can do what I'm doing here for the pages of the books. Using a thicker icing, you can then drag your scribe through it to make lines, or you can dip a scribe or a paintbrush or some other tool in cornstarch and make dimples or other like depressed areas, or you can flatten the icing down so it's not so puffy, again using a tool that's dipped in cornstarch. It's a neat way to add different texture to your cookie designs. When working with smaller sections of icing, the icing bag is going to be too big to really fit in there and get the icing where you need it to go. So use a scribe or a toothpick to push the icing into the corners or the edges. You can also use a small paintbrush for this. You can also use a flat paintbrush that's been dipped in water and dried off on a paper towel so it's just barely damp to straighten any lines of your icing, or to remove it from places on the cookie where you didn't intend icing to go. So you can see here that by letting the different sections of leaves dry or crust over for a few minutes before piping the next section, you can definitely see a separation between the leaves. And we're doing the same thing with the book. We let the top cover dry, and now we're going to put a large volume of icing in the spine because I want it to be really puffy. Another thing you can do to help prevent cratering in small areas is to make sure you overfill them with the icing. But your icing has to be stiff enough that it's not going to flood outside of its outline if you do this. If your flood icing is too thin, it will run all over the place if you overfill the section. A good way to add volume or a lot of puffiness to an area if you really want it to stand out on the cookie is to place a big row of icing in the middle of the section and let it crust over, and then go back and overpipe it later, and that will give you that dimension that you're looking for. For the base, I want the center to be rounded and for it to have that cylinder-like look, so I'm going to pipe a big thick row in the middle, and then once that crusts over, I'll overpipe it. I made that row in the middle go almost all the way to the edges because I want the whole shape of the base to be rounded. I'm just about finished flooding all the areas of this cookie, and then I'm going to let it dry overnight and add some final details by using edible paint or food color. My cookie is completely dry now and is ready for adding some details. I am trying to distinguish a little bit more between the leaves of the plant, and so I've got some black Ameramist airbrush food color, and that doesn't have to be thinned down with vodka or anything, so that's why I prefer to use that for the black. And I'm just going to put a little bit on in between the leaves with a thin detail paintbrush, and then I'm going to use my flat brush to kind of blend it out so it's not just a stark line, and I'm going to continue to build color until I have it the way I want it. Once that's done, I'm going to use some green Ameramist food color mixed with some white and add some lines for the leaves and just try to make it look some darker, some lighter, and give it some different variation and texture. I'm not an artist. I'm much better at flooding within the lines, like coloring a coloring page with frosting, but I'm going to do my best to add some shading and some highlights to this cookie to give it some extra dimension. I'm using white edible paint for the white. I'll leave a link in the description of all the products that I used. You can also use edible dust or luster dust to shade between the areas. I don't prefer to do that because I find it hard to get it to where I want it to go. Some places it'll be too dark, and other places it'll be too light. So I prefer to use the edible paints or the food color. I also often blend gel food color with some food grade glycerin, just a little bit in order to give it more workable time so that it doesn't dry so fast on the cookie and allows me more time to blend it or get it exactly where I want it to go. Another tip is if you get edible paint or food color where you don't want it on the cookie, you can take a paintbrush dipped in that glycerin or water, but I prefer glycerin, and you can remove it, the extra color from the cookie where you got it and you didn't want it to go. I prefer not to use water because water will eat into the frosting and will start to break it down if you use too much, but the glycerin won't do that. You can also use edible markers to draw your lines in between different areas and blend that out with a thicker or fatter flat brush. You could also blend it out if it doesn't blend easily by using some food grade glycerin on a flat brush and blend it out that way. Now where I'm adding shading at the bottom here, this is where I've mixed my gel food color with a little bit of the food grade glycerin because I want it to be very thin and have a lot of workable time while I blend it out to the edge of the cookie and just create a little bit of shadow underneath these books and plants. I think I'm just about done with this cookie. Thanks for sticking with me till the end. I hope these tips and tricks help you with your more detailed cookie designs. Drop me a note in the comments and let me know. Here's the cookie before and after paint. What do you think?